Well, good evening. My name is Carol Pfeffer, and I'm Vice President for Academic Affairs at Bellarmine, and it is such a delight to welcome all of you to this event this evening. We are so pleased to have Archbishop Kurtz with us tonight, and I know we're all looking forward to a wonderful conversation about an important topic. Before we get started, let me, however, introduce more formally both of our participants. His Holiness Benedict XVI appointed Most Reverend Joseph E. Kurtz, D.D., as the 4th Archbishop and 9th Bishop of the Archdiocese of Louisville on June 12, 2007. He was installed as Archbishop of Louisville on August 15, 2007. Before coming to Louisville, Archbishop Kurtz served as Bishop of Knoxville from 1999 to 2007. And before becoming Bishop of Knoxville, Archbishop Kurtz served for 27 years in the Diocese of Allentown, Pennsylvania, overseeing social services, diocesan administration, and parish ministry. Elected President of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on November 12, 2013, Archbishop Kurtz serves on the executive and administrative committees of that body. In February of 2014, Pope Francis appointed Archbishop Kurtz to the Holy See's Congregation for the Oriental Churches. Archbishop Kurtz participated in the Extraordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops in October 2014 and will be a delegate to the Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops in October 2015. On a more personal note, he's also one of our Board of Trustee members, so I have the pleasure of seeing him at least 4 times a year. Dr. Gregory Hillis is a native of Alberta, Canada. He joined Bellarmine's faculty in the Department of Theology in August 2008. Dr. Hillis is an historical theologian with particular expertise in the patristic period of Christian history and theology. His research and teaching interests also include Christian spirituality, ecclesiology, sacramental theology, 19th and 20th century Roman Catholic theology, Thomas Merton, and Eastern Christian history and theology. Greg is currently working on a book-length project on Cyril of Alexandria's Trinitarian theology. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hillis to more formally introduce the event tonight. Thank you for joining us.
I think that was me, sorry. First of all, I'm really impressed with the crowd that we have given the temperature out there. You heard I'm from Canada, and I moved down here not to have temperature like this. But anyways, Archbishop Kurtz was gracious enough to want to discuss publicly his participation in the Extraordinary Synod. And so the way that this is going to work is I'm going to ask some questions of him for about 45 minutes or so. And then after that time, there are 2 microphones, one on each aisle, and there'll be some time for questions afterwards. And I'll give some direction about that at the time. But first, I wanted to talk, Archbishop Kurtz, just about the Synod. I'm not sure if everybody has a background, knows much about it, about the context of it. So I wonder if you could say a few words about the context of the Extraordinary Synod and why you think Pope Francis wanted this particular Synod to be about the family.
Good. Well, thank you, Greg. Boy, this sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Can you all hear me? I also want to thank you for this invitation and all of you for coming. Those of you who came to hear this talk and those of you who thought it's warmer in here than it is out there. So whatever the reason. Maybe the best thing to do is to say that the word synod itself means a conversation or coming together. S-Y-N meaning together. And since the Second Vatican Council, ending in the late 1960s, there have been roughly every 3 years, maybe every 4 years, a general synod. And in fact, I believe is it the 14th or the 15th that will be this coming October? I should have come better prepared.
I'm not sure.
Okay, well,
I don't
good.
know.
Well, I feel better then. But just to get a sense that there have been synods, general synods, for the last 40 years or so, synods of bishops to talk about very specific issues that are usually very relevant to the life of the church, the life of the world, or both. Now, Pope Francis, in his wisdom, said, well, I want to do what I would call a double header. And those of you who are baseball fans and know World Series, what a better time than October to have double headers. And so this is the first time since the Second Vatican Council that there were actually 2 synods, one in each year, on the same or a similar topic. The synod of last October in 2014 dealt with the challenges of family within the world and within the church. So the emphasis was especially on the challenges. And the extraordinary synod, and this was only the 3rd since the Second Vatican Council, is normally a smaller group. So there were, I think, 180 official delegates. There were 180 bishops, most of whom were the presidents of the various bishops' conferences throughout the world. There's about 115. If you look at the whole world and the bishops' conferences, that's how many there are. So, Greg, I think our Holy Father, I guess I'm now trying to read his mind a little bit, but I think it would be safe to say he saw, first of all, the importance of the family, both for our society and culture, as well as for the church, and the family, most importantly, for the life of each individual. And he saw that, that if we are to treat one another with the dignity as children of God, then one of the first places to look will be the family. He himself has spoken an awful lot about a movement of secularization, which has moved our world, sadly in many cases, into isolation, where instead of strong and vibrant families that build up, that often families are occasions of hurt and even of isolation. And he's talked, as you probably know, about things like a throwaway culture in which people too quickly forget about the person and get so involved or enraptured in things, or, as he said, in kind of a turning in on yourself, that isolation, which we might say is somewhat of a symptom of a secularization within our world, leads to an indifference. And I think that was the prelude to saying, I'd like to call together the church to reflect and to discern both on the opportunities and the gifts of family, as well as the challenges in our own age. He's also said, and this will be the final thing I'll say about it, he said that this is meant to be a pastoral direction, so that he wasn't calling necessarily for changes of doctrine. As he says so often, I'm a son of the church. I know that my responsibility is to be faithful to the teachings of Jesus preserved through the centuries in and through the church, but rather it is to be creative in the way in which we reach out to families today.
This isn't your first time as a delegate to a synod. You participated in the Synod on the New Evangelization,
right?
Which was called under Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. There were a number of reports. I remember hearing Father Tom Rees. He's covered other synods in the past, and he wrote that he seemed to sense that this was a different kind of synod, that it seemed to operate differently. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about your experience of both synods. Did this synod, in fact, operate differently? Was there a greater ability to express opinions, which seems to me that Pope Francis had suggested he wanted at the beginning of the synod? I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
Sure, I sure can. And remember, for those of you thinking, well, what is even the purpose of the synod? It really is to gather together to help shape and inform, in an effort of collegiality, a direction within the church. Obviously, our Holy Father has ultimate responsibility to take that guidance and that, what I hope will be wisdom. This was my sophomore year, so I was a rookie, in 2012. In 2014, it was my sophomore year. So it's risky to start to give talks about something when you've only done things twice. Cardinal Wuerl of Washington, he doesn't brag about it, but I know he said that this was his 7th. So you probably have the wrong guy here tonight in terms of talking about it. Here's what I would say would be the same and then what would be different. Maybe I can do them together. What was the same is that for every synod, there's an initial document called the lineamenta. That's Latin for threshold, and it's meant to get us started. And every time, bishops throughout the world have been asked to to seek consultation and give opinion. That's new. That's not new. What is new is the great emphasis that Pope Francis played. Now, I have to admit that even in August and September of 2012, I did have focus groups within the Archdiocese and opportunities to hear from people about evangelization. We did much more this past time, but it's not as if that was never done. It's never been done, though, to the extent, and especially throughout the United States.
Are you referring here to the questions that were asked?
That's right, the consultation ahead of time, and in fact, I can say that normally in the past there might be, from the United States perhaps, anywhere from 25 to 50 dioceses that actually formally gave reports, because people are enormously busy. This time virtually everybody did. So there was much greater participation. That was one thing. I think the other thing that is true is the Synod began with Pope Francis saying to us, and by the way, that's a great thing with the Synod. I'm not sure if there's any place in the world, maybe there is, where you can have 140 or 160 delegates coming from virtually every corner of the world, coming together in one group. So it was fascinating just to interact and make friends with people throughout various continents of our world. Pope Francis began by saying, listen, I want 3 things. Please speak openly. Then he said, please listen humbly. And then he said, and please allow the Holy Spirit to influence your hearts. So and I think that had a great effect on us. And certainly it did on me. In that sense, that was different. The first week was probably just as boring, I hate to say that, as the first week, it was actually 2 weeks, 2 years ago, because they were formal presentations that were given. Each delegate thinks his own presentation is super, and that everybody else's is kind of, well, we're listening. So there was an awful lot of listening, and you really had to be attentive to that. Pope Benedict introduced something new to the Synod model, and that was the last hour of the day, usually from 6 until 7 at night. That was the open mic time. And anybody could just press their button and have an opportunity to say something. That's probably only occurred about 3 synods now. That was very, very fruitful, I thought. So that was something new, and we'll get into some of the, probably I'll save to the small group things, because there's a lot to say about small groups, but maybe I should save that to say a little later. Okay.
Pope Francis wanted people to speak openly, and from the outside looking in, it certainly appeared as if the delegates were doing that, and it appeared as if there was a fair amount of disagreement. And Pope Francis has, in numerous places in his daily homilies, but he's also said this in his interviews, that he doesn't mind disagreement, that he thinks disagreement is a very healthy thing. And I wonder if you could say a bit about whether that impression from the outside about there being a fair amount of disagreement is in fact the case, and what your opinion is on the existence of disagreement in the church, well, open disagreement.
Sure. I begin by saying that there wasn't a steady flow of open disagreement. I mean, nobody can sustain that. You know, even in a family, it's hard to do that. So I would say there was a sense of listening, and in many cases, it was listening to the various talks of the delegates, and I think it was characterized by discernment. There were, however, areas where I think people did raise contrary opinions, and I think that was a very healthy thing to do. In fact, I'm now interested more in councils from years, things that you're much more of an expert in than I am with your background in patristics. But if you look at the Acts of the Apostles, and you look at the Council of Jerusalem, there were differences of opinions there. So if people picture things being uncivil, or no, that would not be the case. I hate to disappoint, but I think there was frank speaking. I think some of my interventions were in response to what I heard other people say, and I think that it's a healthy thing, quite honestly.
Yeah, I did. When I heard people, you know, they're very concerned. Some people were very concerned about this display, what they saw as being a display of open disagreement. And you don't have to dig very far in the patristic period, or frankly, in Vatican II, to see bishops arguing with one another, and healthily. And so I sort of, you know, I'm not so worried about that myself.
Yeah.
I wonder, though, one of the points of disagreement was the interim relatio. And when that came out, some of the bishops themselves articulated strong disagreement with it, Cardinal Burke being one of them. And I wonder if you could say, I know that your working group expressed some concerns with the relatio, and I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
Maybe for the good of the audience, it would be good to say something about what a relatio is.
Yeah.
If you don't mind. Because I didn't know what some of these words meant. Relatio is just kind of a working paper. I wish they would just call it a working paper. It would make it a lot easier. But what happens is when you get to the synod, pretty much the first day after the opening mass and the opening prayers, and by the way, I forgot to say something about what was unique about the witnesses of the married couples, and I'd love to be able to say something later if we can. But getting back to the relatio, what actually happened is there was the first document that came out in December. There was a lot of response to that document from throughout the world, and from that came what was called the Instrumentum Laboris, which is Latin for working paper. And that document was the one that we studied getting ready for the synod itself. So that informed the interventions that the bishops gave. We had to give our intervention in I think it was the 8th of September was the deadline. And then the relator, or the secretary, in this case it was Cardinal Erdo from Hungary, it was his job to pull together an initial document. And that was called the document before the debate, so to speak, it was called. And that document was read to us and given to us in writing that first Monday. Then we had that whole week of discussions where every delegate had a chance to talk, and we had that open mic thing at the end of each day. I think we had Saturday and Sunday off. I was not complaining. But the working group didn't have that time off, because what they did is this small working group put together what was to be a summary of that first week. And that was what you're calling the interim relatio, or what they call the relatio after the debate. And that was presented Monday. The relatio that was presented had in it a lot of things that many of us didn't hear said. And so we can get into some of the concerns I had about having access to what the written forms were. I would like to have had more of it. You might have a question or two on that. But I did have some concerns about where some of the things that were in there came from, because it was really meant to be the fodder for the working groups that would work that second week. And I was probably the best thing I could say is I think the working group that worked on it was looking at doing the first draft of a final document. I think they did include things that were not necessarily talked about in that first week, but I think they did it thinking these would be things that everyone will consider important. So they put them in some fashion. I had concerns because I thought that there was some lack of clarity and confusion that could come from some of the ways they expressed themselves. I didn't necessarily have difficulties with them putting the topics in for conversation.
One of the things that relatio discusses is gradualism.
Yeah.
And maybe I could say a few words about that and then get your impression.
Sure, go
of
ahead.
what
Because I had some interventions on that the second week.
Well, did you want, maybe
No,
you
do it, you do it.
Okay. So one of the things that, one of the great insights, I think, of Vatican II, particularly when it comes to ecumenism, was a sense that we can talk about other religious communities, Christian communities and other religious communities, as having some participation, some form of communion, even if we are separate in some way. In other words, that there's something true and good and beautiful in those things. And it seemed to me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that what the authors of the Relatio were doing was appropriating that notion of gradualism to suggest that those relationships, whether it be people who are cohabiting together or same-sex couples, themselves witness to something true and good, even if they aren't doing so in the fullness of what we would like. In other words, that there's a form of sort of gradualism in which they're participating in the fullness of truth. And that seemed to me to be what the Relatio was talking about in gradualism. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think there were two concepts. I don't know how much, I don't want to bore you all to death on this thing, but I think
I do it all the time.
Well, there were two concepts. I think from the Second Vatican Council came the notion of that the true church subsists in the Catholic Church. Yes. And so I'm not sure that's necessarily related to the word gradualism or gradualness, but rather I think it's the notion that there are elements
yes.
that are true, but the fullness, if you would be in the Catholic Church, but
That's
there are
right.
other elements. So that was one concept that came from the Second Vatican Council. I think there was a second concept that actually was developed in Familiaris Consortio, and this would be a good chance for me to mention this to all of you. After each synod, the popes usually issue what's called an apostolic exhortation. If any of you read or heard of Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, that's the apostolic exhortation following the Synod of 2012. Well, there was another synod on the family in 1980 when I was just a teenager. Actually, I wasn't a teenager at that time, but it feels good to say that. But in 1980, there was a synod on the family, and the apostolic exhortation by the then Holy Father, St. John Paul II, was called Familiaris Consortio, or the community of the family. And in that, he gave a concept of gradualness or graduality. His concept was this, that if someone understands that they are off the mark in terms of the truth, if some of their life has even elements of sin within it, and they admit that this is not a positive state to be in, that a good confessor or someone helping that person ought to assist them gradually to come to, if you would, a conversion of heart within their life, and to do it in a very pastoral way. In fact, in the late 1999, there was a vademecum, which is kind of a friendly, kind of a book to help confessors, kind of like classic comics used to be for classic magazines. Well, you'd have this vademecum to help confessors, and they were often given this principle of gradualness. In other words, the two elements, though, and this is where I think there was, a haziness. I had a difficulty in the use of gradualness, and in fact, it was removed because I think the concept is valid, but I don't think its expression in the relatio was well formed. I think it was it caused great confusion.
Was it the idea that there is something true and good in those relationships?
I don't think the principle of gradualness does not actually address things that are true. I think the principle of subsidiarity does.
Right.
Now, I will give you an inside scoop on that one, because that was also in the second, in that relatio. In my small group in the second week, there were 26 people. 18 of them would have been bishops who were delegates, and the other 8 would be either families couples who were participating, or in this case, there was an Anglican bishop from Durham in England. And this Anglican bishop said, you know, we really shouldn't, I don't think, use that image, because you're almost saying that we Anglicans are like people who are in imperfect marriages. And he actually influenced our small group, and I think that influenced the writing of that second, what became the final relatio.
Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, in essence, what he said was there was a concept in that second document which almost said what you were saying, that whereas the fullness of marriage is within sacramental marriage, or even within a natural marriage, not sacramental, but between a man and a woman, committed to life, love, openness to life and love, and that the application of this principle of that the truth subsists,
subsidiary,
but there are other elements in that was in a sense trying to say that there were positive elements, but it was also emphasizing the comparison that we're comparing people of other Christian denominations as somehow people in imperfect marriage situations. And he thought that was not the most ecumenical way to handle it. And in fact, he ended up citing other parts of the Second Vatican Council documents that ended up being in that final document.
Right.
So it was a truly ecumenical endeavor.
Well, it's very helpful that you helped me with my terminology there in terms of subsidiarity and gradualism, the two different ideas.
And not so much subsidiarity, but subsistence, that the church subsists within the Catholic Church, but there are elements, true elements beyond.
Yeah, and it's that concept that kind of gets brought into the relatio, but gets removed in the final relatio.
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, that brings us to, I mean, obviously there were a number of other issues, but it's worth talking about the sort of big ticket issues, as it were, of the Synod, and that is communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, as well as for the Church's understanding of and relationship to same-sex couples. And can you tell us a little bit about the debate that occurred in the Synod about both of these issues?
Well, let's begin by saying the overall agreement, and it was a strong agreement, is that the Church needs to support authentic witnesses to marriage. And the Church also, as Christ would, needs to reach out and accompany people who are in imperfect situations. And the question became, what does it mean to accompany or walk with someone who is distant from the Church, or maybe feels distant from the Church? And in this case, perhaps one of the examples that was used, there was very little talk, quite honestly, about people in same-sex unions. That did not come up as much. I don't think it came up at all in the first week. But there was a great amount of talk about people who have experienced a divorce and then had a civil marriage. And the question became, and this is where, if you'd want to talk about what you might call debate that occurred, where there wasn't, people were not all saying the same thing. I think the strongest sentiment was to say we should not burden people unnecessarily. and that if the process of annulments, of trying to assist someone to see if there may be elements in what we might call that, quote, failed marriage, that maybe even from the beginning were problematic. And I know Pope Benedict had talked about this. I know Pope Francis has talked an awful lot about it. In fact, he's actually established a special committee that's working this year to come up with a study and some proposals on this. I think there was not unanimity, but there was great consensus on an effort to streamline the process without sacrificing what we would call the integrity of the bond. In other words, no one was saying we should change the church's teachings or the teachings of Jesus on the fact that when a man and a woman marry each other, that marriage is for life. No one was talking about changing that. They were talking about how do we accompany people who have tried to do this as best they can and have failed. So I think the whole process with regard to annulments, including not having exorbitant fees. Now, in the Archdiocese of Louisville, we have no fees, and that's been for some time, probably for 10 or 15 years. So that I think that the whole idea would be to remove what might be any unnecessary burdens from people who find themselves in very difficult situations. The bishops were very aware that when there is a marriage, not only is that the person who's been in a failed marriage remarried, but they also have to be aware that there may be children from that first marriage. There's a wife or a husband that perhaps feels wronged. It's an extremely complex pastoral situation. And so that was where the majority felt. There were a number of people, it wasn't the majority, but there were a number who said, no, we should do even more. And there were two elements that were being considered. One is the element of what we would call spiritual communion. And some have said, I myself have said to people who come to church who are in a state that doesn't allow them to receive confession because their situation continues, they find it perhaps pastorally not good to separate, let's say, from someone in a second marriage. And so they're in a great bind that they just cannot solve at this point. And so the advice in the past was to say, well, even though you can't receive communion with all the faithful, you can make a spiritual communion and join your hearts to Christ. There were some who were saying, well, if you make a spiritual communion, that's union with Christ, and there's no difference between that and receiving communion. A lot did not favor that thinking. They thought it was sloppy logic, quite honestly. And I was one of those who did not favor that. The second proposal was what you would call a penitential, non-canonical path that someone, and perhaps they connected it with what is the experience in the Orthodox Church. And could there be a penitential path? Many people, including myself, had grave concerns about separating out our pastoral solutions from the law of the church. Because once you do that, I guess almost you ask the question, well, what then should you not do? Because there are other great needs too in people's lives. So those three issues, the annulment, the notion of spiritual communion being expanded, and the notion of a penitential rite. If people read the New Relatio, I think they're somewhere in the from 50 to paragraph 50 to maybe 55, or somewhere in that area. All three of those are still in there for conversation and reflection. Did I confuse it?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not for me. You mentioned the Orthodox approach to this, and I heard an interview with Bishop Callistus Ware, who was actually one of the observers to the synod. And he's a very important Orthodox scholar, and he suggested.
Was he at this synod?
He was.
Gosh, I didn't meet him.
I think he'll be at the next one. You should meet him.
Good.
He's very nice. But he suggested in this interview that he had great hopes that the synod might come to a solution like what the Orthodox have come to. You mentioned that that's still on the table, but do you see that as being any kind of a possibility?
Many, I'm not as familiar with it. Many had great concerns on whether that's really been a very good use. If on a practical level, in a sense, it's worked, and they're concerned with whether in the end it has caused kind of an erosion of understanding of the indissolubility of marriage. So there are many who have raised concerns. I'm not a student enough. I've not talked to any Orthodox priest or bishop to say what has their experience been. It's certainly one of the areas that's being studied. It was not one of the, when I said, I think if you were to say, well, where did the momentum seem to be? It seemed to be in the area of streamlining annulments. I would say very much so. You know, I want to say something too about that I should have mentioned with my introduction. Somebody said, and you just said again, that I'll be a delegate at the Synod. Actually, I've not been appointed as a delegate at the Synod, so I don't want to have you all go home and say that. There was what you might call a confidential election among the bishops that was to advise the Pope, and I was among those who were elected, whose name was sent, but it's really the Pope who appoints. So
right.
I usually tell people, if you want to know, just ask, you know, does the person have some letter appointing them as a synod? So I don't want to presume, I don't want to be guilty of the sin of presumption.
Right.
Yeah.
But I expect to see you in Rome in October.
Yeah. But
yeah, I'll say that.
I bet on synods and the Kentucky Derby, but I do lose money on one of those.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
There are 4 paragraphs in the final relatio that didn't receive 2/3 of the votes, and these they did receive
3
solid
or 4.
majorities.
There were 3 maybe, and one that just barely got under the thing. Yeah.
It was 4 by my count, but I could be wrong. These revolved primarily around the big issues, and in fact, the notion of some of the ideas that we've talked about that were found in the interim relatio were in those 4 paragraphs. Now, Pope Francis did something interesting, and he had those paragraphs still published along with the votes, which received fairly solid majorities as well. And I wonder if what you make of that decision that he made to publish even those that weren't formally approved by the Synod Fathers.
Well, first of all, the first decision the Pope did was to publish it. And normally, that's not necessarily done. Usually, the published thing is the apostolic exhortation, you know, the final product. So even the fact of his publishing it, now Pope Benedict also made the decision to publish it 2 years ago, but I'm not sure how much that has been a standard part. He asked that the voting itself be published so people would see what the votes were. I suspect that if they had been removed, there would be less conversation on these things, and it is meant to advise the Pope as far as what framework the Church would be moving in, and so I would certainly respect his opinion on that. There were, I guess, all 4 of those, 3 plus, I think you needed 123 votes, and one of them's 125. So I think one of them is, but nevertheless, they are the areas that probably had the most controversy. Yeah, I would agree with you. Some of them, and most specifically the one dealing with same-sex relations, however, I'm not sure why people voted against it, because they could have voted against it in its present format because in their judgment it wasn't pastoral enough, or they could have voted against it because they thought it was I should have put it the other way. They voted against it because they thought it was too much straying from doctrine, or some may have thought that it wasn't pastoral enough. So we never do know why that particular one. It was interesting, though, that the one on same-sex relations that did receive the votes came actually from Africa. And that was the one that dealt with their concern that aid, specifically from the United States and from other countries, but specifically the United States, was being tied to the requirement of what they considered a cultural intrusion into their land, that they would be forced to accept particular approaches to marriage that they thought were not acceptable, not only to them as a church, but as a culture. So that one received the vote.
So some voted, in your assessment, you don't know, but some voted against that particular paragraph because they either thought it was straying from church doctrine or they felt that it wasn't pastoral enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's probably
That's
the one
confusing,
that I would say is, I can't give you a good read on what that was about. The other ones were the ones I mentioned, though. One was on the issue of the penitential path for people who are divorced and remarried for communion. The other one was on this quotient of expanding the notion of spiritual communion beyond the spiritual. And I think the one that just came under the wire that I think you were considering, the fourth one, had to do with speaking of positive elements in, let's say, people who are cohabiting.
Yes.
As opposed to what I would tend to speak about is goodness in the hearts of people. I would talk about, if I was a pastor and I was visiting someone who wasn't married, they were just living with each other, I would begin, as I said in my address to the bishops in November, when I would make parish visitations, the first thing I did when I get into a house wouldn't be to tell them how to rearrange the furniture. I would look for positive things that were in their hearts and their longing and their desire, perhaps their love of the children, and then try to lead them into maybe formalizing and getting married in the church, etc.
You wouldn't come in swinging, in other words.
No, exactly. And I think our Holy Father is saying the art of accompaniment, the art of walking with people, seeing the person first, even if there are difficulties in their life, seeing that person first, actually, in some ways, is not new. When I was ordained a priest in 1972, and I think back about it, the priests that I tended to admire were the very ones who had that ability to join with people, to accompany them even in their imperfection, and to walk with them, to see the dignity of that person first, and then to lead them in conversion, and I would say in mutual conversion, because I as a bishop need to continue to be converted to Christ. But that is, I think, a proper understanding of gradualness in that sense. So.
Well, negative reaction to the Synod has been vociferous. Positive reaction too, but that's not as fun to talk about.
Let's go for the negative.
Yeah. They range from those who argue on the internet that Francis isn't the real Pope. I've seen those. To you and I both received a Twitter response from somebody today, and I was asked to relate to you his disappointment at how tenuous the Synod's grasp on truth was, right? To more mainstream reactions from folks like Ross Dudat at the New York Times, who wrote in an op-ed called "The Pope and the Precipice" that conservative Catholics might want to consider the possibility, this is the quote, that they have a role to play and that this Pope may be preserved from error only if the Church itself resists him, end quote. In some of the U.S. hierarchy, I'm thinking here, Cardinal Burke referred to the Church feeling like it's a ship without a rudder, have also been very critical of Pope Francis. What do you make of this criticism of the Synod and relatedly of the Pope?
Well, let me begin by saying the media is both our friend and also one that complicates things. The media is our friend in this sense that if we didn't have the media, we would know nothing. We would have very little opportunity to be engaged in this process. It's probably the media that brought many of you here today. The others came because I guess they're getting extra credit in your
That's
course.
right, yeah. If you're one of my students, come up to me after.
Yeah, that's right. So what I'm about to say is not really a slam on the media. I think you need to work with the media, and I do think that it's one of the reasons why we need to have sessions like this that do our best to speak frankly with people. However, I will say this. I had the privilege, the second Wednesday, to go for the press briefing. There were always 3 bishops and Father Lombardi who came out, gave whatever initial statement we wanted, and then answered the press. And one of the things I took up was the fact that I think the press treated that interim relatio as a final product. And I think, in fairness, the press should have corrected that. I think it was a mistake. And so I think anybody who is a student of the Synod, and again, I'll get back to the question of how do we uncover and preserve the truth of our faith? I think any student of the Synod has 2 choices. They could either go to that final relatio, which I think is basically solid, not everything in it do I necessarily think is written exactly in its final form, but I think by and large, it's a very solid and good document for us to study. There's 62 paragraphs. They were voted on by all the Synod. The middle one was not voted on by anybody. It was written by 5 people who did their best to write it, but it was an interim document. So anybody who really wants to be a student of the Synod should not only read that interim document, but should read all 10 of the small group documents. And I was, as you know, a moderator for one of those small groups, because I think that then gives the process, which is synodality. Synodality is not just one person making something public, but rather the group process collegially with the Holy Father giving recommendations. And so if somebody wanted to read that interim report, they should then at the same time read all 10 of the small groups, because that was the result of all that whole second week. I said to the press at that time, you know, that's very demeaning to me to treat that interim document at the beginning of the second week as a final product. What does that make our small group work? Like, are we minced meat or what, you know? So I think that's a very important thing to do. I think also that is what sometimes when people have difficulty with what they call the confusion with some of Pope Francis's statements, I don't think it's the statements of our Holy Father. I think it's the life they take on, and I think even an improper application. I can give you an example of that.
Please.
When our Holy Father was on the plane coming back from Rio, he was there for World Youth Day. That would have been, I guess, the summer of 13, maybe. He did an interview, and he was asked about a priest who was serving in the Vatican, who was accused of actually improper moral relations with another man. Now, he never said whether that actually happened or not. He said to the people, well, I have found that person is living a chaste and a good life, and who am I to judge? Now, the phrase, who am I to judge, got on T-shirts, and it took a life of its own. When the Pope was then asked about what did he mean by that phrase, do you know what he said? He said, I'm simply repeating what's in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that there's a dignity to every person, and if somebody converts, they should be welcomed in that. But I think so there would be an example, I think, where a phrase has taken on a life of itself. And sometimes it's hard to correct that life. And so I'm actually, obviously I favor the leadership of our Holy Father. I will admit that we had meetings twice with him, and in both of those meetings I had a chance to raise the question, do you know that some of the things you say take on a life of their own, et cetera? And of course he said he did. And So I think it was a fruitful conversation.
I wonder, I think some people react to his style as well, more informal and therefore not as precise as, the emeritus pope, who was a very, still is, I should say, a very good theologian, a very precise person who appeals to people who love precision. And Pope Francis speaks against, doesn't speak against precision, but he's much more interested in a pastoral approach. Not to say that Pope Benedict wasn't pastoral.
Pope Benedict was, in fact, many of the things that Pope Francis is saying, he rightly credits to Pope Benedict. So I think there's a great continuity there. But you are right about the metaphor. You're absolutely right. I think Pope Francis is at his best at the morning homily. I read them, and I love them. I think, gosh, I wish I would have thought of that. And in fact, because
I don't think he'd mind if you borrowed.
Well, because it's a 6-hour difference, he gives a homily in the morning, and 4 hours later, I'm giving it.
There you go.
As if it were no, I always credit him. Most of the time, I credit him.
Well, he is, and this will be my last question, and then I'll open up for questions from the audience. But Francis will, God willing, visit the United States next year. And you've already mentioned that you've had a chance to meet with him twice?
I did. We met, well, of course, I was with him all through the Synod, but Cardinal Dolan and I, in October of 2013, we met with him for about 35 minutes, and then I went in actually on October 4th, the Feast of St. Francis, and met with our Holy Father again for about 35 minutes with Cardinal DiNardo, who's now the Vice President.
Some have suggested that and again, this is a portrayal that I've read in the media, but some have suggested that not all the U.S. bishops are, on board with Pope Francis. What is the relationship between the U.S. bishops and Pope Francis is the first part of my question. And the second is, what do you think is Pope Francis's viewpoint of the U.S. Church and the U.S. context?
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled that he's coming to the United States.
Why isn't he coming to Louisville?
Yeah, why not? Why not? You're right. You're right. When we met, I said to the Holy Father, now we not only want you to come, but we want you to stay long. It does look like it's going to take a second visit for him to come either to Louisville or when we look at the growth of the church in the United States, I think there's a great concern that coming just to the East Coast and not seeing especially the growth that is in the South and Southwest also. And we would be thrilled if he would come to Louisville, but I also think that there's great merit in considering some of the real growth areas that are occurring. And I don't know if he'll come back the second time. I understand he may be coming to Mexico, and I'll have a chance to be at least part of the conversations about that. So first of all, the first question to answer is I'm thrilled at that. And I will say this, because I think while the conversation was private, the actuality was public. I did have the great opportunity on December 16th of this year to meet for 50 minutes with President Obama and with Vice President Biden to talk about many issues, some of which we are on the same page and others in which we're not. And one of the things I did talk to the President about was obviously the Pope's visit and my hope that we might be able to craft things that would allow the Church to really be a support to the common good and to be able to thrive. And we're not necessarily on the same page with things concerning religious liberty and all, but we certainly are on the same page concerning charity and the gifts of charity. And so I'm cautiously always hopeful that some good things can happen. Now, with regard to our Holy Father, as the president of the Bishops' Conference, I'm obviously not in charge of all bishops, you know that. But it is the role of the president of the Bishops' Conference to seek to maintain unity in truth and charity. And that is my role. It's to maintain as much unity in truth and charity. And so I will always focus on where there is unity. And I think I've already mentioned where there are concerns. I don't think there's such great concern among the majority, certainly, with something that our Holy Father has said. I think it has to do with how things are interpreted and possible confusion. I'm very grateful that our Holy Father will be coming to Philadelphia for the World Meeting of Families. It's the 8th meeting. While it's not confirmed yet, our hope is that, of course, he'll come to the United Nations. And if he does, it'll be almost precisely the 50th anniversary of Blessed Paul VI coming to the United Nations in the 1960s. And I also hope he'll come to Washington. My big hope would be that we'll have a chance for the bishops of the United States to meet with our Holy Father, to show our love and our concern, our faithfulness together with him, in union with him, and that he will have a chance to address us. It will be his first time coming to the United States. So in many ways, I would say he sees the United States very much from the perspective of South America, of Argentina. Why wouldn't he? Just as we see the rest of the world from the perspective of the United States. I found that the 2 times we've met, and if you add them together, it would be more than an hour, there was a genuine concern on his part to know more about the joys, the difficulties, the challenges within the United States. So I found him to be extremely approachable and easy to meet with. Now, I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you did.
Did I?
They'll let you know.
Okay.
Yeah. I will say before we open up for questions that both you and I were talking about this earlier, but if you're wanting to understand Pope Francis more thoroughly, there's a biography by Austin Ivory called The Great Reformer that both you and I have read, that at least I would recommend. Would you?
I think I would too.
Yeah.
Just so that you'd know, there's a lot of books out there, and we were saying that many of them have been kind of hastily written. I think Austin, he's from England. He writes for the Catholic Record in England, and was one of the beginners of Catholic Voices, which is very now growing within the United States, and I think very positive. He himself, I didn't know this, but you told me this, actually has some credentials in
he has a doctorate in Argentinian politics.
Of all things,
Yeah.
talk about good timing.
Yeah.
So, but I found his book to be, first of all, very readable, and I think very balanced. I found it to be, I didn't feel that there was an axe to grind. I think he was trying to give a full picture, and it helped me understand just the life of Pope Francis and all that he experienced. I learned more about Argentina, and you know what I ended up watching over Christmas?
What's that?
The movie The Mission.
Oh, yeah.
Are any of you familiar with the movie The Mission? And that was, I think, I had never seen it, but that was, I think, in late 1980s, I think it was issued. I forget who the actors. Oh, you know who is the guy who's
Robert De Niro.
Robert De Niro.
Yeah.
Robert De Niro. So, and he's very young, so you can tell the difference. But that is an experience of the Jesuit presence of what was called reductions, or their effort to provide a protection and yet an organization of the natives, the Guarani, in Paraguay and modern day Paraguay and Argentina. And I think the interaction is very helpful to understand the history from which Pope Francis comes, especially with the presence of the Jesuits in Argentina, which is a very different presence than we've experienced, let's say, in the United States.
Yeah. So if there are any questions, we would really appreciate if you could come up to the microphone. I know not everyone is comfortable with that, but it would help for everyone to be able to hear your questions. We have a few minutes for questions, and if you could just say your name and just introduce yourself briefly.
I'm Peter Glauber, and I'm here with my wife, Mary Jane. This is a less controversial question, but I think when you talk about pastoral counseling of families, in the United States especially, but also Germany, England, there are so many where we have Catholics married to practicing Protestants, and they're trying to raise families, raise their children, and as we teach the importance of Christ's presence in the Eucharist and how that is something that is such a necessary part that most Catholics feel. It's such a barrier and such a sore point that, and there are papal documents, I know during the time of John Paul II, that certainly on certain occasions would allow intercommunion in the Catholic Church with the Protestant member who believed in the actual presence, not without going through consubstantiation, transubstantiation, or just actual presence. And there is something that it would seem to be not so controversial, and yet it is just, it's almost as if it's done, the people come in the back door rather than the front door, to use the racial thing in America. It's just not done, or it's not openly allowed. It's not invited. They're not invited to do that, and that is something that I think certainly should have been, I hope, was discussed, and I hope it could be addressed, and hope that that church law could be more liberally interpreted to allow the couples to receive communion together. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you. Thank you for presenting that. I have a few observations. One is, interestingly, that we had a little bite to eat beforehand, and we talked about it because I think, Greg, you're in exactly the same situation.
Yes, I'm an Episcopalian.
Two observations. As we were talking at dinner, I said, when you experience people coming from all these various continents, it made me aware that while that is an issue, in many cases in the places you've mentioned, when you look at many other places, certainly Africa would be a good example, they bring issues of polygamy. They bring issues from Asia of dowries, domestic violence to women. And so it didn't get as much play in conversation. Now, we talked at dinner about this. There are two goods that we're trying to preserve, and one of the goods is very much what I jokingly talk about, the BMW, I'm not talking about cars now, but the BMW test, that in the Catholic Church, in terms of community, receiving communion is receiving Christ, truly, but it is also an act of unity of belief, morality, and worship. And that has been a long-standing understanding of what communio or communion is. So that any conversation about that would have to then get into those issues. So it's not just a matter of, well, let's just change this, but I think there would be further conversation. That doesn't minimize, though, the fact that you are right in saying that there are, in the United States and in certain other parts of the world, a high number now of families in that situation. Yeah. It's not, when you read the Relatio, toward the end there is something, I have to study it.
There are two places it's referred to.
You've saw it. There is a presence. So when we do consultation, that is an opportunity for us to hear with the consultation that we'll be having. We didn't talk
and
about
you've heard from me and from him as well on this
that's
now.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Now, are you saying that's sufficient?
Oh no,
I'm teasing. I'm just teasing. I'm just
I'll
teasing.
keep talking.
But thank you for raising that. Yeah.
I have a question. My name is Ken Stemmerman.
Yes, Ken.
Tolstoy once said that happy families are all alike, and unhappy families are each unhappy in their own way.
I remember him saying that. I never understood that, but
the laity who appeared at the Synod were, as I understand, from very happy families, people who could testify to the strength of their marriages. There are a lot of us who have, we've gone through annulments, gone through the broken marriages, And I wonder, wouldn't the fathers be better prepared to talk about the modern family if they had a lot of people there who came from what is very common in the American Catholic Church, divorced Catholics?
Ken, thank you. Let me say a double answer to that. One is the consultation that I participated in last year, and I hope to do this year. Thank God we have a little more time, because while we haven't gotten the official document, I've been reading it because it's in origin, so somebody got the official one. I think we have until the end of March, and we will do certainly a similar consultation as we did last year. And that did involve people coming from brokenness. And I'm glad you brought that whole story up. Maybe now I'll think more. Now I think I understand a little more of what he said. I never liked it because I never understood what in the world he was talking about. So thank you for that quote. You are right that all of the witnesses were very inspiring and positive witnesses. Now, I will say one was from Retrovi, which of course is for people who are in hurting situations and seeking to renew or restore their situation. So you are right in that the witnesses were inspiring. I have to admit that. They were very, very good. And I thought it was helpful for us to hear that there are people out there who are seeking to address and reach out to people in need. But you're right. Right now, the primary way that we will hear, or that I will hear from people who are in such broken situations that don't yet have a good ending, or the way you said it better than I am, will be through this process now. And I guess tonight's one of those.
I will say that if the Synod Fathers would like to hear from an interchurch couple, Kim and I can always come to Rome, you know.
Talk about generosity.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
Hi, my name's Teresa, and I'm here with my husband, Tom. We teach natural family planning here in the Archdiocese. And we've heard a lot about walking pastorally with those in imperfect relationships. Was there much discussion about walking with people to help avoid those kind of relationships? And I want to quote a Father Dan McCaffrey, who has a natural family planning outreach organization that says the Synod will not be successful unless it addresses the need of clergy to preach the Catholic teaching on sexuality found in Humani Vitae and St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body.
Teresa, my intervention was very much on that topic that you just said. Now we'll see how successful I am. I think there was less time than should have been spent on what it means to inspire people by reaching out and preventative things. I agree with you. I think you will find when you study the last relatio that you'll find there is a very healthy segment on marriage preparation, on natural family planning, on the vision in Humani Vitae, as well as in other areas. So I'd encourage you to read that document. It seems to me that when we talk about the art of accompaniment, I was on, I forget, CBS this morning on Christmas Day. There was a presentation, and Charlie Rose asked me about that, and I said, well, the art of accompaniment is for hurting people. We're all hurting. All of us, or we're an accident about ready to happen. So we do have to do more to reach out. And even in the helping professions, in family therapy, in Catholic charities, in the work we do, we all want to do that. We all want to go upstream and say, how can we help people avoid these? One of the areas that hasn't been talked about enough, it was in there, some of the statistics that are showing children who live with their mother and father who are married in their first marriage in, I think, the 1960s was in the area of 75 to 80%. Now it's 46%. Now, are there heroic single parents? You better believe there are. There's no question about that. But I think most people would, and the statistics are showing, that we should be doing things that will help people have healthy and sustained marriages. And in fact, the studies are showing that the vast majority of people, 98% interviewed, said that's what they want. They want a faithful, permanent marriage. And I think that is part of what our Holy Father is saying, that this culture that tends to be a culture of indifference and doesn't put high priority on that fidelity in marriage is something that we need to accompany people to make it happen. We can't blame people for it because we're all swimming in this culture, but what does it mean to, what I would say, go upstream and try to help, so in preventative ways. I think you'll be pleased with the document. I can't say that there was enough attention, I don't think there was, at the Synod itself on that level.
Moving toward the next couple of months, could you be a little more specific?
Tell me your name.
I'm sorry, Carol Harris.
Yes, Carol.
And moving toward the next couple of months, a little more specific about how you're going to acquire the information through the consultations that you need to be able to get back to Pope Francis in a timely manner.
Yeah, well, thanks, Carol. I think, first of all, remember, the consultation, it's a synod of bishops, and so the idea is not for me to survey and take votes, but rather to be informed. And I think that's a very important thing. The three ways that we did last year, and it was a hurried thing because we had so little time. One was the Archdiocesan Pastoral Council. Now, in our structure, I think we have an excellent structure. The Archdiocesan Pastoral Council is made up of the chair people of the parish councils in all 111 parishes. Because some are small and combined, we probably have a maximum of 80. And so we had a special day, and I think the plan would be that the March meeting that's already scheduled would actually be a day, and we would try to prepare those people who are coming. So that's one vehicle. That would not represent everybody, but the parish councils would be given information, so ahead of time they'd be able to talk maybe at their own parish councils. So I hope that would be a multiplying avenue. The second area would be the consultation with the priest council. I think they're an elected group, some appointed, but the majority are elected, and so I rely very heavily on them. Many of them, hopefully the priests have their ear to the ground, so to speak. A third area, not as easy to discern, is on the website. We will do something on the website. Why I say not as easy to discern is you don't have a dialogue. But it was still very valuable. And so those are three elements certainly that we will do. Now, whether there will be other things, I must admit, even though it's not formal, I'm going to be influenced by tonight. Even though this is not an official part of it and you didn't come necessarily prepared to read the document, what I've been stressing, though, is we shouldn't start from scratch. We now have a relatio. I'm going to be urging people to read and study that document now. And quite honestly, you have a better chance to have some effect if you're going to relate to what's in that document, because that's what's going to be talked about when we get to Rome, whoever gets to Rome, next October. Yeah.
Just one other thing. Will there be a committee or somebody working on the questionnaire or survey or whatever?
I'm glad you asked that. The questionnaire is not from us. It's in fact, if you look at, you get Origins? I should try to sell you a copy. That's from the USCCB. No, I just looked at the document here. I wish I would have studied it even better. This literally is dated December 25th. I just got it though. But it is the lineamenta, or that document, which is the 62 paragraphs, and then it is the questions aimed at response and in-depth examination. And there are 46 questions.
Right. That was my concern, because I have seen that, and I thought, there's 46 questions that if you pull them apart, there's something like nearly 100, I mean like 94 or something, almost essay questions. I mean, is anybody really going to answer those?
Well, you know what happens? I think what happens is people tend to read what I do. They tend to read, and what strikes them as either something that they think is so important to emphasize or something that they think is just outright wrong. That's going to be where their focus is. And I respect that. Now, remarkably, when we had the sessions last time, there was a good diversity. It wasn't that everybody talked about the same thing. I was kind of amazed that people brought different issues. Thank God for the consultation. So that's the way.
Expect everybody to answer every question.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. No.
And that's not what you're aiming for.
No, I don't think so. Even the report that I would give, I'm not going to try to answer every question. My gosh, I'd go crazy. You know, I have to quit my daytime job.
We have a question over here. Is it okay if we go to 8:30?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Hi, my name is Aggie Noonan.
Hi,
and
Aggie.
I am just so glad for the conversation. First of all, I want to say that several folks have already mentioned some of the questions I had, but I had the microphone and I think, oh, I need to register my concern. My first thought, I guess, is that all of the discussion we've had tonight about interim reports, final documents, final this, you know, I just feel a real need to say it's never final, that our church is, you know, living and living in the world that is so blessed with goodness. And sometimes when I hear us as church approach issues, I hear fear. I just, you know, hear so much fear. And I just feel like we need to be aware of the goodness and the strength that is in each and every person. Mm-hmm. And, you know, to that end, I think everyone who has asked a question here tonight has asked it out of pain and out of a sense of, gee, you know, we love our church so much, and the capacity for our church to do good in our world is so monumental. And all of us here want to see that brought to fruition. So I guess my follow-up is really to Carol's question. You know, how can we get our stories, our pain, the goodness that we have in our lives with all kinds of people, whether they're in regular relationships, not great, you know, whatever, it's still so rich. And how can we convey that to our bishops who are going to be gathering again? And, you know, I don't know who exactly the witnesses are. I know who the delegates are, and you can put money that Aggie Noonan won't be invited to come. You know, so how do we as women, as mothers, as people who are so, you know, ingrained in the day-to-day world, how do we get our stories told? Just kind of help me with that, because I struggle with that, and probably a lot of people here do. No matter what they feel about church, they want to be heard. So help us.
Let me say a word or two, if I could, on that. Thanks, Aggie, for it. Two observations. One on the word final. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's the final document of last year's. We ain't going to meet again for last year's synod, so that is the final thing. But if it gives the impression that somehow it's in stone, that's a false impression. Our Holy Father has talked, and I think this is absolutely on target, about a culture of encounter. Now, we're talking tonight about the Synod, and this is an opportunity. You notice I say an opportunity. There will be other synods, but there will also be opportunities within our parishes, within my circumstances as the Archbishop here, to hear the stories of people. They won't end necessarily with the Synod. There will be many others. This coming Thursday, not tomorrow, but next Thursday, I'll do a column and it will be a letter that someone wrote to a priest. She sent a copy to me. She's the daughter of someone who was in a divorce situation, and she tells her story. And it's a beautiful story about how a priest reached out to her mother on their deathbed. You might be interested. It'll be you get the record, and so it'll be next Thursday. Many people have told me that they appreciate the view from the pew that is in the record, and also Catholic Connections, in which stories are being told. But in many ways, I think tonight is one opportunity, and I'll continue to look for other ways to hear of the pain and the joy. I think, in all fairness, I think it's appropriate that our Holy Father talked about it being the gospel of joy. And so shame on us if we spend a whole night and there's not an element of joy. He talked about people being Christians who look like they're always coming from a funeral. And I think our Holy Father, it touches a chord in us. We don't want to be those people, because we do want to tap the joy in even the saddest of stories. So I think there is something about the death and resurrection of Jesus in each one of our lives, and certainly in our parishes. So I would say events like this, letters I know you've written, I always find that helpful to me, so thank you for that.
We have time for probably 2 more questions.
Jack?
I'm Jack Will. I'm also a Bellarmine alum, one of your alums. I want to thank both of you for tonight.
Hey, thanks, Jack.
It's been very inspiring. In some cases, though, I felt like I stumbled into Theology 401 and I need to be in 101, but it was very good. I have 2 questions. One, in terms of the laity or the religious that appeared at the Synod to speak or write reports, how many of them were young people, and where I am in life, young is under 35, under 30. That would be one to hear their voice. The other one is really more, I guess, of a practical question in terms of both official discussion and non-official among the Synod, that a lot of us that have family members, friends, parishioners that are in relationships not approved by the church, whether of the same sex, whether outside of marriage, or if they are in divorce situations and cannot receive communion. When you try to walk with them or engage in these discussions, we find it very difficult because, in their view, unless the church really changes its theology or policy on that, they do not want to come back, because they say, why would I come into a church that is not going to approve of the relationship, and it's not going to accept me, which means in that relationship or receive communion. So I guess my question is, are there practical discussions, particularly from a pastoral standpoint, of how do you walk with someone and engage with someone who is saying that to you, that in essence, I've walked away and I'm not coming back?
Yeah. What was your first question there, Jim? Oh, yeah, the young people. There were very limited number of people who gave witnesses, and they were from all over the world. There was a young couple who was invited from Louisiana, and they ended up not going because they couldn't get babysitters or whatever. So there were most were, I think they would all call themselves middle-aged, but I think most were over 30, and most, I think, maybe over 40. In terms of your second question, I think I'd want to take the families one at a time, because I have found, and maybe you have too, that at the right time, if I am the right person, sometimes I'm the worst person to try to talk to people. They'll say, I don't want to talk to the bishop or the archbishop. But if I am the right person to talk, often people are not, their initial thing is one of, well, unless the church changes things, I'm not going to do this. But I have found once you start talking to people, People are people. They want to be loved. They want to be listened to. Maybe they have never heard the reason why the church has teachings in the way they do, and sometimes when they hear, they say, oh, I didn't understand that. And I remember the occasions when I would talk to a couple who were discussing whether they would go for an annulment. And I remember always talking to the person who wasn't Catholic, because I said, listen, the only reason you would ever go through the agony of going through an annulment is because you love this woman. I'll be honest, it's not because I'm going to convince you that this is the right thing, but you love this woman so much and she wants this annulment. That's probably the only reason you'll go through it. And that touches the hearts of people. When you begin to say, who is it that you love? When I talked at the Synod and I said, people understand faithful love. I know it because I see the way they talk about their faithfulness to their children. They'll do anything for their kids. There's great, great possibilities in every person's life. Now, sometimes they were hurt and they feel ostracized or whatever, and I'll admit that. The other side of it is you change the church's teachings and depart from the teachings of Jesus, you and I are going to be sorry, because we're not going to recognize the church that Jesus gave us. And you may not agree with me in saying that, but I do believe that's true. In the document itself, the first document talked an awful lot about mercy. And I agree with that, by the way. I'm for mercy. But the second document talks about that in Christ, mercy and truth meet. Did you see that? It says it twice. And I believe that that's part of what people understand. They want, whatever happens, they want it to be based and grounded in great truth. So I think it's one at a time, and I'm not the right person necessarily to reach everybody, but I've talked to some parents sometimes, and they say, yeah, our kids don't necessarily, they're not ready to come back, or I'm waiting, or so that's my response. And I think that's what our Holy Father's sense of accompaniment means, because he often uses the word patience, doesn't he? He says, boy, we have to be patient, because people don't always work on our timetable. So that'd be my small response, at least.
Okay, we have time for one more. Scott?
Thanks. My name is Scott Holzknecht.
Hey, Scott.
Hey. I think I'd like to advocate for, when I say young people, I'm talking little kids, like 8, 9, teenagers. But I'm wondering if there's much conversation about that part of the family. Specifically, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but I'm a teacher in high school, and sometimes I worry that even on the parish level, there's just not a lot there for them in terms of they may or may not have a youth minister. That youth minister may be part-time. There may be, pizza and a lock-in every once in a while, but really pushing them, challenging them in their faith. And part of that is even, I'm familiar, I have friends and family that go to some churches like Sojourn, that it's just packed with these young families, and the kids are going to these youth services where there's rock bands and things like that. And I'm not advocating for any sort of a less reverent liturgy, but part of any good teacher is not just having truth, but then meeting the student where they are. And if kids, it's hard to convey some of the reverence and mystery to a 9-year-old when down the street there's the rock band, and there's just a lot more. It just seems like there's so much energy going into young people. Maybe that's the best way of putting it. Mm-hmm. I worry that our resources don't go directed towards our young people, meeting them where they are enough. And I'm wondering if that was discussed much. And like I said, I know it's different in other parts of the country, but just any thoughts you might have on that.
Sure, Scott. Yeah, and certainly your work at Trinity and your service to the church puts you in a great position to see, especially as these kids get a little older. There wasn't enough talked about that I mean, let's begin with that. It does get down to this theology of an encounter, however. It gets, because I remember as a pastor, I thought, you know, I don't want to underestimate what these kids are capable of. And I found even kids who were in grade school were unbelievably capable of understanding a lot more than we thought. So that I guess I would move, I'm not against entertainment. I'm not a big rock band. I don't know a lot about rock bands, so you're not going to get really good thoughts from me on that, on what to do on that stuff. I'm not against those things. They had, out at Incarnation, they just had something that I did a thing on, what was it called? Not Awake, I forget the name of it now. Huh? Praise, what is it? Praise, or yeah, it was, I forget, I did a little message to them. I think what we need to do is help people meet Christ, so that if the rock band or the event moves them toward entertainment and farther from Christ, I think the gain will be short-lived. That'd be my own observation. But I'm amazed at how young people can do things. And you know where I see it? Some of the kids who are in 8th grade who write their confirmation letters to me, I tell them, I'm amazed. I said, who helped you write these things? And they do write them themselves, you can tell. They're very well done. So I think part of it is, and it's with adults too, is we need to treat people with the dignity that says Christ is in their lives, and we need to allow them to encounter Christ. And in a sense, what our Holy Father is saying, if we ask people to think less of themselves and reach out to others, that will actually bring out their best self. So I do think that's the direction to go in.
I apologize if I did. My heart wasn't in that rock band comments as much as I might have made it sound.
No, I probably overkill that, didn't I?
Well, I think that the root of it was I just worry that sometimes kids only get what's left over once we have enough resources for the adults.
Well, I think you're right. And I'll say another thing. I'm kind of impressed now as I go to some of our Catholic grade schools. I don't have as much opportunity to go to public schools, although I'll be meeting with the superintendent of our public schools in the near future to talk about, you know, our good concerns. But I'm kind of impressed by the tone of some of the schools I've been at. And maybe even more so than I was, say, 10 years ago. So because I'm going to want to build on what's good. I mean, we all have to, when the day is done, we all have to figure out what's good that we can build on, or we'll all be depressed, you know. So I think there's a certain optimism. You're correct that we need to call forth people. I'm not sure it may be paid, but I do think that it is what our Holy Father calls authentic witnesses. We have to call forth people, and when you see them alive and inspired, helping others, you see the effects that has. Yeah, thanks.
Well, that's all the time we have tonight. The Archbishop is actually leaving for Haiti tomorrow via...
No, I'm leaving for,
via Rome. Yeah. So I wanted to say thank you very much for your willingness to take time out.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And thank you to you all for coming tonight. Drive safe.
Good, thanks. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everybody.